As Washington departed his office, he warned his nation against the perils of party factionalism and foreign entanglements. It was these two exact problems that would plague the next few years of American history. In this video, we will see how the divide between the Federalists, like John Adams, and the Democratic Republicans, like Thomas Jefferson, dominated events in the late 1790s and turned every policy decision into a bitter mud-slinging brawl. The 1796 election was a testament to the severe political divisions which had already settled into the country. John Adams, running as a Federalist, went head-to-head with Thomas Jefferson as the Democratic-Republican candidate. Once colleagues under Washington, Adams and Jefferson now stood as rivals, symbolizing the growing political divide. The Federalists argued for more central power and feared that the fledgling United States would collapse without a firm federal hand. The Democratic Republicans wanted a limited federal government with power kept in the states. The Federalists saw the Democratic Republicans as misguided, destructive fools who would replicate the bloody chaos of the French Revolution, while the latter saw the former as would-be tyrants crafting a tyranny no better than the one the Revolution replaced. Each saw the other as a deadly threat to democracy. In this way, the 1796 election set the tone for every U.S. election held ever since. Unlike modern elections, though, there was not much of a campaign. Adams and Jefferson did not make electoral speeches or make public appeals to the delegates who elected them. Since there was no public vote for the presidency was determined through political maneuvering among the 138 state electors, rather than a public vote. In the end, the result was the closest thing to a compromise the two dominant parties were capable of. Adams won the presidency by 3 votes, but under the rules of the Constitution, as they were at the time, Jefferson's second-place position earned him the office of vice president. It was hoped that this shared administration would heal the political divides that the election had torn open. Those hopes came to nothing. While Adams and Jefferson maintained mutual respect and occasional friendship, they would spend the next 4 years locked in constant disagreement. Meanwhile, the two factions at large only got more hostile to each other. Adams now faced the intimidating task of following Washington, who as a sacrosanct national hero commanded support, or at least respect, from almost everyone. Adams had his admirers. He'd been one of the chief architects of the Revolution and the Constitution after all. But he was not the hero Washington was. Adams' presidency was constantly judged in the shadow of his predecessor. Adams' reserved personality and lack of political charisma, combined with Washington's towering legacy, made his presidency feel like a step down to many. Another challenge came from a lack of worthy public servants. The ruling elite was made up of wealthy people, but their wealth was not as stable as many of them liked, and their roles in government or Congress were not particularly well paid. As a result, fewer men were willing to set aside their private affairs to serve in government. Alexander Hamilton, for example, had stepped down from his role in the Treasury in 1795 to return to his business activities, and Henry Knox reportedly left his post because of the dismal salary. In Congress, there were frequent complaints of members failing to attend votes so they could pursue private interests. As one congressman complained about his colleague, "This is difficult to understand," and did not speak to the weight of government officials. Has thought it more for his interests to speculate than to attend his duty in Congress, and is gone home. With Vermont, Kentucky, and Tennessee joining the Union by 1796, and with settlement intensifying in the Northwest after 1795, the challenges of an ever-expanding nation continued to grow. For example, the factional split was already taking on a regional element, with Federalists predominating in the North and Democratic Republicans gaining a stronghold in the South. Slavery was part of the explanation for the latter. The Republicans favored states' rights, and Southern states were eager to protect slavery from any abolitionist turn in the federal government. The success of the slave revolution in Haiti, launched in 1791, and by 1797, having seized control of the country and wiped out most of its white population, was a source of great anxiety for the slaving states. Abolition proposals were defeated in Congress in 1797 and 1800. But that they even existed was a sign to the South that they'd be better off with reduced federal power. Conflict at home was one challenge during the Adams presidency, but conflict abroad was equally troublesome. Washington's assertion of neutrality in 1793, followed by the Jay Treaty with England in 1794, had soured relations with the French. Adams and the Federalists were more Anglophiles than Francophiles, and France knew this, so they naturally took a hostile stance to the Adams presidency. They snubbed American diplomatic efforts and declared all American ships carrying British goods as legitimate targets in 1797. Fearing war, Adams summoned a special session of Congress, who authorized the expansion of the Navy and the calling up of 80,000 militiamen in anticipation of a conflict with their former ally. Jefferson and the Republicans were appalled. They blamed Adams for the breakdown in relations, and insisted that France was about to destroy Britain anyway. So anything less than an alliance with France was suicide. Adams was not convinced, but he did not want war either. So he dispatched a diplomatic mission to Paris in late 1797 to try to smooth things over. These envoys received humiliating treatment. The French government demanded an apology for Adams' hostility, demanded that Congress cover any debts France owed to American citizens, end its neutrality, and join France's war, and top it off with a considerable loan to the personal use of unnamed French officials listed only as X, Y, and Z. In other words, a bribe. Only then would France consider receiving the diplomatic mission. When Adams got word of the outrageous demands, he wrote off the mission, but kept the details of the absurd proposals private. Jefferson, believing that Adams was concealing information for the purpose of provoking France and undermining pro-French Republicans, made it a scandal and forced Adams to disclose the information. To Jefferson's dismay, the publication of France's demands in the XYZ affair had a totally opposite effect. The American people were outraged, and pro-French feeling in the U.S. practically collapsed overnight. It was so intense that Jefferson's Republicans had to publicly disavow France or risk being treated as traitors. The XYZ affair catapulted America and France towards conflict. In July 1798, Congress even authorized the U.S. Navy to engage French vessels who attempted to seize American ships. There was no official declaration of war, but the two nations were now in a state of quasi-war at sea. With this development, Adams and the Federalists had a genuine fear that pro-French elements in America might trigger a revolt or civil war. To avoid this, they passed a series of controversial laws targeted against dissidents and immigrants who Adams believed might be loyal to France. The Naturalization Act increased the time required for an immigrant to become an American citizen from 5 to 14 years, on the belief that recent immigrants tended to have more pro-French, democratic Republican attitudes, and should be excluded from society long enough for these attitudes to fade. The Alien Friends Act allowed for the deportation of foreigners without trial, and the Alien Enemies Act allowed for the arrest and deportation of the citizens of any country the U.S. was at war with. All three acts were unsubtle attacks on French immigrants or pro-French attitudes among new immigrants. The Democratic Republicans immediately attacked the laws as dangerous overreach that were designed to target them. But even more controversial was the Sedition Act. This made it a crime to publish false or malicious statements against the U.S. government, Congress, or the President himself. Of course, what qualified as false or malicious was left vague. It was, in effect, a law criminalizing any potential criticism of the government. The Democratic Republicans saw it as a direct attack on the freedoms of speech and the press that the First Amendment protected. Their fears were well-founded. 25 people, including journalists, publishers, and Democratic-Republican public figures, were arrested and convicted under the Sedition Act by the time Adams left office. This attempt to curb criticism of the federal government proved deeply unpopular among the American people. Some of the men persecuted under the law, like Vermont Congressman Matthew Lyon, were turned into folk martyrs by regular Americans who were disgusted at Adams' overreach. The harsh law also encouraged the states to assert their rights. Jefferson and Madison secretly penned the Kentucky and Virginia Resolutions of 1798 and 1799, respectively, which asserted the right of states to nullify unconstitutional federal laws. This theory became an essential element of later conflicts between state and federal rights, such as in the Civil War. The Alien and Sedition Acts did for the Federalists what the declassification of the XYZ affair documents had done for the Democratic Republicans. What was supposed to be a blow against the other side was instead a massive shot in their own foot. Adams became deeply unpopular, and the controversy over the Republican connection to the French quickly fell out of the spotlight. The toppling of the First French Republic by Napoleon in November 1799 brought a welcome change in French policy. Napoleon rolled back hostility against America, and Adams seized upon the opening to negotiate the Treaty of Mortefontaine in September 1800, ending the quasi-war and restoring a relationship of free trade and friendship between the two nations. 2,000 American merchant vessels had been seized and several hundred men were dead on both sides. While a diplomatic victory for Adams, it deprived the Federalists of their strongest anti-French argument against the Democratic Republicans. Meanwhile, the Alien and Sedition Acts remained in place as ammo to barrage Adams in the upcoming election of 1800. Newspapers were nothing new in the States, but the age of political partisanship fueled a war of words in the press that inflamed political conflict. Despite the Sedition Act shutting down many Republican papers, new ones emerged faster than they could be suppressed. In 1800 alone, 85 new Republican papers were published. Accusations of tyranny and treachery were flung both ways, and each side could point to the dramatic events of Adams' term as proof for their side's success and the other's failings. Republican papers like the National Gazette took aim at John Adams as an overweight tyrant who they mockingly referred to as his rotundity. Federalist papers, like the Gazette of the United States, counted with charges of Republicans as French traitors and slandered Jefferson as an atheist. In the end, Jefferson emerged victorious with 73 votes, though tied with his running mate, Aaron Burr. It fell to Alexander Hamilton, now returned to the political arena, to convince the delegates to break the tie. Of course, Hamilton may have disliked Jefferson, but he utterly despised Burr. Through intense political maneuvering, Hamilton ultimately influenced the delegates to break the tie in Jefferson's favor. Hanging like a shadow over events was the death of George Washington in December 1799. The death of the revolutionary hero, and the one man who could stand above political factionalism, was an ominous sign. Washington's warnings against political factionalism had gone unheeded, and his absence left a leadership void in the young nation. As Jefferson prepared to assume office, he did so carried upon a wave of anti-Federalist hatred that was reflected right back in equal measure, and which would define the tenure of the third President of the United States.